Hi, my name is Christian Loyer from i-nexus, and today I will present you one of my favorite continuous improvement tool, the SIPOC. SIPOC stands for Supplier, Input, Process, Output, and Customers. The SIPOC is a visual tool that helps understand and document a process from the very start of it until the very end of the process. It is also a great team working tool, as in order to build a SIPOC, you will need different functions of a company. In that sense, it helps every single function understand who needs to do what, when. To explain the SIPOC, I will choose a process everyone can relate to. We will make a cheesecake. First consideration when it comes to a SIPOC is the fact that it is presented in a linear manner, in the sense that your suppliers give you inputs that you then put into a process that will generate an output that you then deliver to your customers. Hence the acronym SIPOC. However, when you build a SIPOC, the first step you look at is processes. You will identify all the steps that goes into the process section first. After that, you will look at what inputs you need to run your process, who is supplying you those inputs, what outputs you generate from the process, and finally, who your customers are. So from a building tool perspective, the process is more process, input, supplier, output, and customer, or as I like to call it, PISOC. Okay, so let's make our cheesecake. The first thing we are going to do as a team is identify the different process steps to make a cheesecake. The reason why I like to use making a cheesecake as an example to build a SIPOC also is because making a cheesecake is a recipe. And indeed, a SIPOC is very similar to a recipe. We have a list of ingredients that go into a recipe that generate a cheesecake for our family and friends. However, as you will see when we build the SIPOC, there will be many more inputs that we will identify and also many more outputs, because we'll think of all aspects of making the cheesecake. All right, so let's get going. Step number one of making a cheesecake is, first of all, make the base. That specifically means here, butter and line your tin. Step number two will be to put digestive biscuits in a food plastic bag and crush it to crumbs. Step number three will be to transfer the crumbs into a bowl and pour over the melted butter. Right now, I'm identifying those steps on my own, but typically I would have a team of people around me, different functions, and together we will build this SIPOC. What I'm gonna do for now, because my process here of making a cheesecake has 15 steps, we will take a break. I will write down those 15 steps and we catch up straight after that. All right, so we have now identified all the steps to make a cheesecake. Just to make sure we are aligned, let's read them together. After step number three, which was transferring the crumbs into a bowl and pour over the melted butter, we then mix until the crumbs are coated. We tip them in a prepared tin. Then we chill in the fridge for 1 hour. We slice vanilla pods in half and we scrape out the vanilla seeds and place the cream cheese, icing sugar, and vanilla seeds into a bowl. Step number 10 is then beat all of that with an electric mixer. Step 11, we tip in the double cream and we continue beating. And then step number 12, we spoon the cream mixture into the biscuit base. We leave to set in the fridge overnight. When we're ready to serve, we bring the cheesecake to room temperature and then we serve the cheesecake with a smile. So those are the 15 steps of our process step. Typically, you would have identified this with different functions, different team members of your organization. Once that is done, we step back and we identify all the inputs that go into the process steps. So the way you identify inputs is by asking a very simple question to your team members. What inputs do we need to make the base? In this case, we can identify 3 different inputs: butter, a tin, and also a baking parchment. I like to use a codification system to make sure I identify every single input with every single process step. So the way I do that is by identifying input. For step number 1, input number 1 will be butter. Using the same logic, input number 2 of step number 1 will be a tin. And input 3 of step number 1 will be baking parchment. That way I know that those 3 inputs are needed for step number 1. And we will do exactly the same for every single step. We're just going to do step number 2 together, and then we're going to take a break. I'm going to write the rest of the inputs and we catch up later. For step number 2, which is put digestive biscuits in a plastic bag and crunch, what do you need? First of all, 250 grams of digestive biscuits. So input of step number 2, input number 1 is 250 grams of digestive biscuits. Input number 2 of step number 2 will be a food plastic bag. And input 3 of step number 2 will be a rolling pin. Again, here we know exactly that those inputs will all go into step number 2. The codification system tells us that those 3 inputs go into that step and nowhere else. So what I'm going to do now is take a break, write down all the inputs, and we catch up when I've done that. So we have now identified all the inputs. However, we have run out a bit of space, so we only go up to step number 10 here. However, if you would like to have the full SIPOC of making a cheesecake, we have an Excel file that we are happy to share with you if you get in touch with us. For now, let's have a quick look at the inputs that we have identified for this SIPOC. We did step number 1 and 2 together. In step number 3, you will see that we need, for example, a bowl, but we need bowl number 1 because we will need another bowl later on. So this is an important consideration here, because maybe you don't want to mix the bowls, or maybe you need to wash this bowl before you use it again. We need the digestive biscuit crumbs, which is an output of a previous step. So sometimes the inputs that you're going to put here are outputs of previous steps, and that's an important consideration when building a SIPOC. And input number 3 of step number 3 is melted butter, as opposed to just butter in step number 1. So even though it's butter in both cases, in the first instance for step number 1 is just normal butter at the room temperature, and here we're looking at melted butter. What is important and what you can realize straight away here is, as opposed to a recipe where you only see the ingredients, here you see everything that you need to run every single step. And this is the key challenge when building a SIPOC. You need to take your time with the team to identify everything, absolutely everything, every single tool, template, document that you need to run every single step. If we identify, for example, here from a recipe point of view, which are the ingredients, we can see that butter is an ingredient. The digestive biscuits is an ingredient. We have, again, the malted butter here. We have the vanilla pods. And then we have step number 9, where we input a lot of the ingredients, the cream cheese, the icing sugar, and the vanilla seeds. The rest of the inputs, as you can see, as opposed to recipe, indicate everything else that you need. Electric mixer, the fridge, the bowls, kitchen knife, and so on and so forth. So now that we have identified all the inputs that go into the process, you need to identify who's going to supply you those inputs. Here it is a recipe, so the example is a little bit shaky, but what I'm going to do is try to identify specific suppliers, specific brands to give me those inputs. So in the same fashion that we identify the inputs, as a facilitator, I would ask my team, which suppliers are we looking at to give us those inputs? If we look at supplier of input 1.1, and again, I'm going to use a codification system here. I personally like the President butter. So the supplier is going to be president. For the tin, I'm not too bothered. I'm gonna buy my tin, or we're gonna ask Tesco, a grocery chain here in the UK, to supply us that tin. So supplier of input 1.2 is Tesco. For the baking parchment, I like to use a baking parchment from a company called Baco. So as you can see, we are connecting every single input with its supplier. The codification system also tells us exactly which supplier is giving us which input. So what I'm gonna do now is do exactly the same as I did for the supplier. I'm gonna write down all the suppliers to the inputs, and we catch up when I've done that. So I have identified suppliers up to step number 6. You get the point. We would do exactly the same down to step number 15. So as you can realize, second consideration here is that if you run a SIPOC workshop, you can easily spend half a day to a full day flushing out a full SIPOC in great details. So let's have a quick look at the suppliers that we have identified for step number 2. For example, for the 250 grams of digestive biscuit, we like the McVitie's, so we're gonna use that as a supplier. For the food plastic bag, again, we're going back to Tesco and supplying the plastic bags from there. I like personally the Hamilton rolling pin. For the bowl number 1, which is in step number 3, supplier of input 3.1, we'll go to IKEA and get a bowl from IKEA, just because. But as you can see here, for step number 3.2, the digestive biscuit crumbs, here we are looking at step number 2 in terms of the supplier of that input. So sometimes some of the suppliers will be previous steps in the SIPOC. For the electric mixer, we are going to use a KitchenAid. For the prepared tin, again, we have a step as a supplier, step number 1 in this case. And for the fridge, we are going to use a Samsung fridge. And so on and so forth. You identify all the suppliers of all the inputs that go into your process. That's the hard bit of a SIPOC. Then comes the easy bit. What is the output of this process? Clearly here is a cheesecake for 4. I'm going to use a codification system again. I'm running out of space, but output 1.1 is a cheesecake for 4. However, this is the obvious output. And when we build a SIPOC, we have to think of the outputs that are not so obvious, but that will generate perhaps even more work. Because at the end of the day, the key point of doing a SIPOC is to understand everything that needs to be done to get to the output that will satisfy the customer, but in the most efficient way possible. For us, when you cook a cheesecake, as we know, but very often the recipe will not show that, in a SIPOC, we would identify that we will end up with, for example, a messy kitchen, and also, most likely, dirty plates and cutlery. This is important because it means that some of the team members or a function of the organization will have to clean the kitchen, and we will have to wash the plates and cutlery somehow, not only eat the cheesecake. The final step is very easy. We have to identify the customers. In this case, we're just gonna write friends and family, and because I'm running out of space, I'm gonna write it here. And perhaps your dog. But there you go. This is how you build a SIPOC from the start until the end of the process. It is a tool that I love using to identify processes and identify every single inputs and who is going to supply us those inputs. Make sure you identify not only the obvious outputs, like the cheesecake in this example, but everything that will generate work afterwards, and identify who your customers are. If you do a good job, a next level of analysis for the SIPOC is then to do value add, non-value add analysis, try to identify where you are adding value and try to remove the non-value added activities, identify KPIs to make sure you measure the process. But the most important bit is probably making sure that you have very high quality inputs, because after all, garbage in, garbage out. If you control your inputs, you are almost guaranteed a very good output. So there you have it. I hope you have enjoyed the explanation of the SIPOC today. Please subscribe to our channel for more whiteboard video like this one. Thank you very much.